Hello and welcome back to my tournament recap series. I'm going to be continuing recapping the games that I played in the Southwest Class Championship. If you haven't had the chance to take a look at the first video of this series where I recapped rounds 1 through 3, then you'll want to check that out. However, if you have taken a look at that one and you're ready to see rounds 4 through 6, that is the 3 different games we'll be taking a look at in this particular video. The 3 games I play in this series, I play against an international master here in round number 4 that we'll get right into. I play against 2 other players in rounds 5 and 6. Let's go ahead and jump right into the recaps, and we will take a look at those. Alright, so jumping right into round number 4, I'm playing against an international master named Sebastian Kostolansky. I'm usually pretty caught up on a lot of the international masters and grandmasters that play in a lot of these open events, but this was actually the very first time I had seen this particular player's name. But he has obviously a very strong player with an international master title. He has pretty high ratings online. So I was definitely looking forward to this game. I usually enjoy playing against higher rated players, get lots of experience against tough competition, and get to pretty much learn the most, in my opinion, from playing the toughest players. So in this particular game, I knew that my opponent was going to start off with the move pawn to e4. Pretty much this is what he plays every game that I could find online or in tournaments. And as we will see in some of the games later on in this particular tournament, a lot of the times I have been playing recently the Sicilian defense, specifically the 4 Knights Sicilian, which is a Sicilian variation that I really like a lot. For this particular game, though, I decided to kind of try something new. I have been working a little bit more on playing pawn to e5 recently. And I decided, if I'm going to test it out against a higher rated player, it is kind of a situation where there's less to lose. If I lose the game, I'll learn from it. Not really risking much in terms of rating points or anything like that. Might not want to test this out against a lower rated player, but okay, we're playing International Master in this game. Let's go ahead and check it out and see how things go. So he plays e4, I play e5. And generally speaking, I'd seen that he had played mostly the Ruy Lopez in all of his games, and that's what we got on the board. So knight f3, knight c6, bishop to b5. I go for pawn to a6, attacking the bishop. Bishop retreats. I play knight f6. This is all pretty standard stuff so far. He decides to castle the king. And here I decide to go for what's known as the open Ruy Lopez, with the capture of knight takes on e4 here. A lot of other options are available here as well. You can go for pawn to b5. Sorry, you can go for pawn to b5, and then after the bishop retreats, many different options. Bishop e7, bishop c5. There's different variations in the Ruy Lopez. They go further from each of these moves. A lot of times you'll eventually put the pawn on d6, you'll get castled, and then play kind of develops from here. It is very important from Black's perspective that we do have to do something about White's potential threat of taking our knight on c6, followed by taking the pawn on e5. Now that they're castled, that is a legitimate threat that we have to watch out for. But in this particular game, I decided to go for the capture on e4 and go into the open Ruy Lopez or open Spanish. Now, this is a much more rare option. I think statistically speaking, I had seen somewhere that it's played maybe in like 10 to 15% of games. It is a perfectly good option, that all being said. And the best move for White to play against this is to play the move pawn to d4. Essentially, if White doesn't play d4, let's say they play a move like rook to e1, trying to win back the pawn on e5, the advantage that Black gets from this is we can play the move knight to c5, attacking the bishop on a4, and inevitably we're going to be able to eliminate this bishop, gain the bishop pair, and Black is in pretty good shape in these upcoming middle games. So pawn to d4, as he played in the game, is the best move. It prevents the move knight to c5, and it also looks to open up the center very quickly because we are slightly behind on development without having moved the bishop or castled the king. Now, you definitely don't want to take the pawn. You take the pawn, rook to e1. It's maybe playable, but stuff like this gets quite tricky. Not really something I wanted to go for. Both my knights are pinned, and I'm under a lot of pressure. So the main move after pawn to d4, if you look kind of in the database, statistically speaking, is for Black to play the move pawn to b5. The bishop retreats. Then you go pawn to d5. You allow White to recapture the pawn on e5. Usually they'll take with the pawn. You go bishop e6. And then White has a couple of different options from here. This is kind of the more, let's say, common or standard way of playing the open Ruy Lopez. However, I had a different idea in mind after the move pawn to d4, and that is to play the move bishop to e7. And this is a bit of a sideline, and I was kind of under the assumption that my opponent would not be ready for this. First of all, if he did do any preparation for me, which I'm not sure if he did, but if he did do any preparation for me, first of all, he wouldn't see that I play the move e5 pretty much at all. He would have definitely expected me to play a Sicilian or maybe even a Caro-Kann, which is something I've also played a lot too. But he would not have expected e5 in the first place. He would not have expected the open Spanish in the second place, and he would not be expecting this bishop to e7 sideline in the third place. So the likelihood that he had any kind of preparation before the game for this position is very, very low. And on top of that, I'm also kind of leaning on the assumption that maybe he's just actually never seen this bishop e7 move in the first place. So the best way for white to play against this is to go with the move rook to e1, which is what he did. And it looks like black's in trouble because if the knight simply retreats, white is going to take on e5 and the knight gets kicked around, and this is actually a very bad position for black. But the idea here is instead of retreating the knight, we also don't want to play pawn to d5 because knight takes e5 is not very good for black. The idea here, though, is that after he played the move rook to e1, I played the move pawn to b5, first attacking the bishop on a4, kind of similar to the b5 move we just looked at in the in kind of the main version of the open Ruy Lopez. And white's best move here is to play rook takes knight on e4. The follow-up from here is to play pawn to d5, first of all attacking the rook. White plays knight takes e5, ignoring the threat on the rook, but attacking our knight on c6. And inevitably something like this occurs. White has a couple of options from here, maybe knight c3, black castles, potentially gambiting a pawn, but getting a lot of counterplay with the bishop pair aiming towards the king side. And objectively speaking, white is a little bit better off in this variation, but it's very messy, it's very dynamic. Even if white takes one of the two pawns, that bishop pair aiming at the king side is going to be quite tricky for them to deal with, especially if they're not well prepared here. They could get themselves into some trouble pretty quickly. So I was, in my preparation for this game, I was under the assumption again that he would probably not want to go for something like that. First of all, again, he has probably zero preparation in that variation, or at least I would assume he hasn't like double checked it in his own opening files in quite a long time. And so I figured if he was going to play bishop to b3, which is what he actually went for in the game, and now we go to pawn to d5. After he takes the pawn, we essentially do get a kind of typical looking position for the open Ruy Lopez. The main difference from white's perspective is that we have essentially inserted the moves bishop to e7 and rook to e1. And it ends up that the bishop e7 insertion is more valuable than the rook to e1 insertion. First of all, there are some situations where white has to be careful about their f2 pawn now that the rook is no longer protecting it. Second of all, black is able to castle a little bit quicker, and this actually becomes relevant, as we'll see, based on the way that he played the game here. So I played bishop e6, defending the pawn on d5. He played pawn to c3. I castled. He played knight to d2. Now, white is generally trying to trade off this e4 knight, and a lot of what white's trying to work on here is controlling the d4 square, potentially making use of a half-open file if they can ever put a knight on d4 and force us to take there. And the downside of this setup for black is we do end up with some slight weaknesses on the c file if white is able to work around that. However, if black knows what they're doing, black is still going to be able to get a good position. So, first of all, I avoid the trade of knights. I play knight back to c5 to attack the bishop. The bishop goes to c2. And now the best move, and the one I played in the game, is the move pawn to d4. And essentially, you're just trying to open up the position. We're also trying to get rid of some of the pieces from the c-file, so that one day we can push our pawn up to c5 and try to use our queenside pawn majority that we do get from the nature of the way that this opening works. So it's a very dynamic version of the Ruy Lopez. If you are playing black and you play e5 against the, and you know maybe you don't like playing against the Ruy Lopez, especially if you don't like positions that are a little more maneuvering and slower paced, you may want to try out the open Spanish or the open Ruy Lopez because it definitely gets into more dynamic, open positions based on the name. And these positions are quite fun. I don't have, again, a ton of experience with them, just based on kind of being a little bit new to the E5 world of things. But from the study and preparation I've done with this variation, I do like the positions that come from it. So he played the move knight to b3, which is not the best way to play here. We can see that black already has a little bit of an advantage. Now, I will point out here that I also kind of guessed that he was going to play this move knight to b3 even before we played the game. And the reason for that is if we back up quite a bit, let's say we go all the way back here to kind of the standard version of the open Roy Lopez. Let's say I had done b5, bishop b3, d5, pawn takes, bishop e6. Let's say he goes c3. Again, we're kind of just following the same moves as he would have played in the game. Again, the main difference is that the bishop going to e7 and the rook going to e1 aren't on the board just yet. Now I would go bishop to e7 just as an example. Knight to d2, knight to c5, bishop to c2, pawn to d4. And it ends up in this specific position that the move knight to b3 is a perfectly good move. Like, if you compare the knight to b3 move when you looked at the evaluation to the side of the board in the actual game versus the version of, what the evaluation is here in this version of the position, here white is in, let's say, a better shape in comparison to the game. And the reason for this is that in this particular variation, I am not able to take the pawn on c3, or at least it's not great to take the pawn on c3. And the reason that taking the pawn on c3 in this particular setup is not the best is that white can trade the knights, black takes back, and then white has this very annoying move, bishop to e4, attacking the knight and pinning the knight, and also threatening to take the knight with a check at the same time. And this is kind of annoying to deal with. Black can take on d1, white takes back, black can play bishop d7 to guard the knight. But here white has different ways of playing. They can now take on c3. They can even throw in moves like e6 and knight to e5 at the right time, or I think even like rook to rook to d3 is like a super complicated way of playing. And really it's white who has all of the pressure on black's position in this version of things. Even though right now I am technically ahead 2 pawns, white's pieces are more useful, and this pin that the bishop is making towards the knight is very annoying. Now you might be wondering, like, why are you showing me all of this? So if we go to, again, the way that the game pans out, which is right here, there's a big difference in the fact that the moves rook e1 and castling have been inserted here. So in the game, I am now able to capture the pawn on c3 without repercussion, because now if white tries to trade the knights and play bishop to e4, pinning the knight, this is actually now just a huge mistake from white. If you want to try to pause the video and figure out the best way for black to play here, it would be, you can try that out. The best way for black to play here, which is to trade the queens, but now, okay, we don't have bishop to d7 to guard the knight, so it seems like we're losing a piece because the knight's pinned. But now we have this move rook to d8, and we are attacking the rook on d1 and threatening back rank checkmates. Even if white trades the rooks, we can still take back with the rook, and we are threatening a back rank checkmate, which does not give white the chance to take the knight on c6. Now this is not possible if we are castled. So again, just to show the difference once more, or if we're not castled, sorry. In this position here, where we're not castled, rook to d8 doesn't work because white can play bishop takes knight with check, and black is completely lost at this point. We're down a piece and in very bad shape. So it's very interesting that the way that he plays the game against this bishop e7 variation, he pretty much tries to play it as if it was the main line of what he might be familiar with the open Roy Lopez. But interestingly enough, it doesn't actually work the way that he has intended it, because the knight takes c5 and bishop to e4 idea does not work in this position. Now, if that doesn't work for white, the problem that they run into is that if they do just simply recapture on c3, which is not what he did, but if he did simply recapture on c3, now white has a pretty bad pawn structure. E5 is a little bit weak, but mainly the c3 and a2 pawns are the big targets. we can trade the queens, play a move like knight to a4, and it's actually white who's going to be suffering for quite a while in this game, because the weak pawns on the queen side are going to be consistent problems for him. And this is what I was really hoping or expecting to happen, but he surprised me quite a bit, where after I took the pawn, he did not recapture the pawn on c3, he actually played the move knight to d4. And now I was essentially on my own in terms of, like, you know, I didn't have any like previous knowledge or know what to do from a position like this. I kind of figured that, well, I knew that I was better, at least somewhat, because I am, at least for the moment, just up a pawn. But this is where I kind of get into a little bit of trouble. I wasn't really so sure how to play from here. I didn't really know what was best. Objectively, there's plenty of ways that are good to play. What I first of all did is I took the pawn on b2. White took back, and essentially he's playing this like a gambit at this point. He is down a pawn, but he has pretty active pieces. Objectively, black is still, you know, a bit better, but he is trying to stir up trouble, and he didn't want to be in a equal material situation with a bunch of suffering. He'd rather be down a pawn with piece activity, which is very understandable. So from here, I remember during the game, I can check the amount of time I used on this move once more. Let me look at that real quick. I remember in the game using, let's say, kind of like too much time in this position here. I thought in this position, let's see, yeah, I thought for about 20 minutes here, which is definitely not a good time management side of things. I knew that I was better, but I knew that I had lots of opportunities and lots of moves that were good. I ultimately settled on the move knight to a5, which is not even really a great move in the grand scheme of things. I also thought for a while about the move knight to b4. I thought about moves other than knight to b4, but I'll just, you know, for the sake of time, I'll just show my other main consideration. I thought about knight to b4, the idea being that I want to, of course, trade off his bishop for my knight. If he retreats the bishop, then I was going to probably play knight to a4, attack the other bishop, and then play pawn to c5, and this is something I would have been pretty happy about. Even though he is able to take on e6, I take back, I'm up a pawn, my queenside pawn majority is starting to roll down the board, I can try to trade the queens, I can play knight to c3. I would be pretty happy with this position for sure. Black is definitely better off at this point. However, what I kind of realized if I go for the move knight to b4 is I thought he had this move bishop to a3, which is quite annoying. And if I end up taking the bishop on c2, and he takes back on c2, I'm actually at a pretty awkward spot here, because not only is my knight on c5 piled up on and attacked a few times, but I can't really move it that easily. If I do move the knight away somewhere, he'll play the move knight to c6, forking my queen and my bishop, and I'll just lose material here. So once I realized this bishop a3 move was quite annoying, I did realize this pretty quickly. I did consider the move pawn to a5 in this position, which actually ends up being the best way for black to play if you are going to go for knight to b4. With the understanding that, you know, let's say he eliminates the... I thought he would take the pawn on b5. And I thought here after queen takes queen, bishop takes back. I wasn't really so sure how to evaluate this. First of all, I'm not up a pawn anymore. Second of all, he is threatening the pawn on c7, so I have to, you know, at least be somewhat concerned about that. Third of all, my own pawn structure is not fantastic on the queen side. I did kind of envision or calculate through this position and get up to this point, but I wasn't really sure how to evaluate this. I didn't think I was better, is what it is, the way that I thought about it. It ends up, though, that the computer says black is, you know, at least a bit better in this position. 0.5, nothing gigantic, but, you know, I would take, you know, a 0.5 advantage. But again, I'm not up the pawn that I was ahead earlier. Little bit hard to rationalize this if I wasn't really so sure about the evaluation. So I thought about other options. I thought about queen to d7, queen to d5. I ultimately settled on knight to a5, which isn't the best way of playing. My idea, though, was to play knight to c4 at the right time, and eventually move the c5 knight and try to play c5. Once again, I'm trying to get the knights out of the way so I can push the pawn up to c5. He played bishop c3, which is what I expected him to play, and I ended up going for this variation with c6, where I'm essentially giving the pawn back. I did allow him to play bishop takes a5, which is not actually the best way of playing. Apparently the computer says that white should play in a different way and not win the pawn back, which is a little bit surprising. I was pretty much expecting him to take the knight and then take the pawn, and we eventually got around to this position here. So at this point, it is a pretty balanced position. I'm not up the pawn anymore, but at least in comparison to the other variation that we took a look at, I do have the bishop pair, at least momentarily. My pawn structure is not worse. I don't have the isolated A and C pawns. He still has the isolated A pawn himself. I knew that I maybe wasn't as much better as I was earlier on, but I also didn't think I was much worse off or anything like that. So I was generally happy with the outcome at this point. The main issue was that I spent probably too much time getting to this position. So I went for rook to e8. He ended up taking on e6, and I had a pretty important decision to make here. Do I recapture on e6 with my knight, or do I take his knight on c6? It ends up that I made the better of the two choices in the game, which is to recapture on e6. I did think about taking on c6, and my assumption would be that he would take on c5. I would take with the bishop. He could play bishop to e4, seemingly skewering me, but I have queen to b6, counter-attacking the pawn on f2. And after, let's say, queen to c2, rook to d8, or something like that, white does get to take the pawn, the king moves away. Again, I wasn't really so sure how to evaluate this. I knew that it is opposite color bishops, which has some drawish tendencies, but the queens are still on the board. My king is a little shaky without the h7 pawn. I wasn't really so sure how to evaluate this, even though apparently the computer says it's just dead equal, essentially. So instead of that, though, I decided to take with the knight on e6. The downside of this is that he does get to keep the knight stuck on the c6 square, where it is quite annoying. But my plan was to work around this and to kind of take away the knight's retreat squares and try to actually end up trapping the knight. So I went for bishop c5. Even though he's lining up towards the rook on a8, there's not really any great places to move the knight to cause damage. He went rook c1. I played queen to b6, attacking the f2 pawn. He protected that. There's definitely some kind of pitfalls that he has to watch out for. For example, if he had played a move like rook to e2 instead, after rook to c8, if he tries to play queen to d5 to guard the knight, now I have like knight f4 at the right time, or rook to d8, knight takes, and then bishop takes f2. There's lots of little tactics if white's not careful about how they do things. Ultimately, though, he did pick kind of the best, or one of the better defenses, I think. But now I play the move rook to c8, attacking the knight. He plays queen to d7 to protect the knight. If he had gone to d5, I was planning on playing rook to c7, doubling up. And then once again, the knight is actually pretty much trapped here. This was kind of my game plan all the way back when I played knight takes e6 and let his knight stay on c6. So this position would be quite good for black. But he ended up playing the move queen to d7 instead. And this is where I made kind of a fatal mistake. I went for the move queen to c7. I think the computer's a little harsh calling this a blunder. It is definitely a mistake, because white now just goes back to d5, and he's able to kind of keep the knight on the c6 square, which is the main problem I run into here. The best move here is one I thought about in a different variation at some point, but I did not really consider it in this exact moment. So first of all, the reason the queen going to d7 is better than the queen going to d5 is because when the queen went to the d5 square, we had the move rook to c7 and then doubling up the rooks. When the queen goes to the d7 square, we cannot play rook to c7 anymore because he will take the rook on e8 and win the rook for free. Now, if we want to play rook c7, but we don't want to lose the rook on e8, we need to figure out, can we deal with the rook being protected, or can we like protect the rook or move the rook to a safer square in the first place? So I did think about the move rook to f8 here, with the idea to play rook c7 and then double up next move. The problem with this move, though, is he plays the move knight to e7, check, forking the king and the rook. I take the knight, he now takes my rook, and now I'm down the exchange, which is bad. So rook to f8 does not work. And it ends up here that the best move is to play king to f8. We protect the rook on e8, and then we play rook c7, rook c8, And once again, the knight on c6 ends up being kind of pretty close to being trapped here, essentially. If white doubles up their rooks, we hit the queen retreats, we hit the rook on c1 first, the rook moves away, we double up the rooks. And essentially here, white's just in a tough spot because the knight's completely immobilized. Next, we'll bring the bishop right back to the c5 square, and then the knight's going to be, the protection of the rook is going to get cut off. And yeah, white's actually just in a tough spot here. The computer says the best way to play is to come back and hit the bishop. The bishop moves, retreat the knight, but then after knight to d4, we're making a fork. White has to counterattack our queen here and make their own fork. We get their queen, they get our queen, we get them, take, and take. It's a very long-winded variation. Even here, you could go further. White goes bishop to b7, rook c3. If they take the pawn, we take the pawn. For all intents and purposes, this is probably still very likely to be a draw, based on the opposite color bishop side of things. But I am up a pawn. I have the passed pawn on the b file. I would be very happy with this position for sure. I don't know if I'd be able to win it necessarily, but there's literally no way you can lose this as black without blundering a piece or something like that. So very long variation, but pretty much it all starts with this king f8 idea, which, to be quite honest, in this moment in the game, I did not consider. If I had played king to f8, I think I have pretty decent chances to at least draw, if not win this game. Mainly because, again, the knight on c6 kind of gets a bit stuck in the mud a little bit, and for all we know, he might not play the best moves as white. He might make a mistake himself, and then maybe we could actually win the game if we get to trap the knight. And if we could ever take the knight and gain 2 minor pieces for the rook, we're pretty happy about that. I did not play this, though. I went for the move queen to c7. I was trying to get the queen off of d7 because I realized that rook to c7 didn't work. The problem is, after the queen comes back to d5, now I'm really wishing my queen was back on b6, but if I go back to b6, it's too slow. He now has the move rook to c1, attacking the bishop, and if I move the bishop away, there's all kinds of discovered attacks, knight e7 check, and then take the rook on c8 after I take the knight. And that's pretty close to what happens in the game. I was running a bit low on time here as well, mainly because I just was kind of overthinking positions at various moments. I ended up with the move bishop f8 of the game. He played rook to c1, and now I think there's actually just really no way to avoid losing material. We have a free move to play here, but I think there's literally nothing we can do to avoid losing the exchange, unfortunately. Because white's next move, almost no matter what we do, is going to be the move knight to e7. Even if we are able to take the knight, he has the lineup of the 2 rooks on the c file aiming towards our queen or our rook on c8. And yeah, there's just really not a great way to play here. The computer says to play king h8, knight e7, and then give the queen up for the rook. And it says that this is black's best case scenario, but this is still pretty tough, I will say. Objectively, we're only down 1 point in material, but the queen is going to outperform the knight and rook combination pretty heavily, I think. But, okay, objectively speaking, this would have probably been my best chance. In the game, I went for the move queen to b7, which, in my mind, for some reason, I thought that this stopped the whole knight e7 idea because I thought there was some kind of pin here. There's no pin here. It doesn't really work. He just played the move knight e7 check anyways, which does win him material. I can't take the knight with the bishop or the rook because I'll simply lose the queen. And if I take the queen, or if I take the knight with the queen, he takes the rook on c8. And I'm just down the exchange with pretty much 0 compensation. I ended up just resigning after knight to e7, and I lost the game here. So, unfortunately, this was kind of a very quick collapse at the tail end of the game. If we go back to move number 24 here, essentially, it is a very balanced position. If anything, I may be a little bit better off here if I play this king f8 move and find this idea. However, if I don't find this idea and play something wrong, if he gets enough free time, he's going to double up the rooks, bring the queen back to d5, and then go for this knight e7 idea, pretty much as happened in the game. But if I play king f8, I buy myself just enough time to work around his ideas and actually probably come out with a slightly better position. I didn't find that in the game. I made a mistake. and he swiftly punished me. We go from kind of a equalish position on move 24 to, unfortunately, a losing game on move number 27. So within the span of a couple moves, we lose the game. And yeah, chess is a bit brutal in that way, but it is what it is. I was pretty happy with the opening preparation for this game. I was happy to get the middle game position that I got, and then just made this mistake of not finding this king f8 idea, and ultimately that led to losing the game. So anyways, though, definitely some learning points from this game. Playing tough players is always going to give good learning points. That being said, this was the 4th round of the tournament. Let's go ahead and get into the 5th one. All right, so we're in the 5th round now at this point. I'm playing against a player named Griffin Mcconnell. He is rated just a little bit above 2,000 FIDE. Yeah, let's get right into it. So I decided to continue with the ready setup with knight f3. You're going to see this pretty much in all of my white games throughout this tournament. That's just the opening I decided to go for. Knight f6, g3, d5, bishop g2, c5, castles, knight to c6. If given the chance, black would like to play the move e5, so we cannot afford to let this happen. I go for the move d4. He plays e6, I play c4, and he takes the pawn on c4. And there's a number of different ways you can play as white against this particular opening variation. You can go for pawn takes c5, which goes for an endgame. You can go queen a4, which pins the knight and goes after the c4 pawn. I think you can go even like knight to a3 and go after the c4 pawn that way. I decided in this particular game, I have played a bunch of these different setups as white in this position. I decided for this particular game to play the move knight to e5. I didn't really have a whole lot of preparation on this particular player before the game started, because generally speaking, if you're playing players that are not like FIDE Master, International Master, or Grandmaster, it is a bit harder to find their games in databases. And I did get the gist during the opening phase that he was playing a little bit slowly, which kind of made me feel like he wasn't really super familiar with this from black's perspective. And so knight e5 is actually a really tricky variation. Black actually has to be very careful with how they play against this. It has a lot of little tricks and traps, and he actually kind of goes for a response here that's not one of the best, but he found a solid enough way to play things. So the best move for black, at least according to my understanding, because I also play this from black's perspective as well from time to time, the best way for black to play is bishop to d7, defending the knight. And then here, I think I had planned on playing knight takes c4, black takes the pawn, and then this move bishop to f4. And essentially here we are gambiting a pawn. We're not winning the pawn back on d4 right away. But the idea is to check on d6. And sometimes there's also cases where you go like knight a3, knight b5 and take the pawn, or knight d2 to b3 and take the pawn back. Yeah, we're down a pawn, but this check is kind of annoying. I think I had a game in, I believe it was the World Open against a Grandmaster. I think he played bishop e7. I checked, he moved the king, I took the pawn, he went here, I retreated. And white is doing totally fine in this position. Black actually has to be quite careful, because if they don't play correctly, they can get themselves into a lot of danger. I think I ended up losing that game, but the opening was totally fine. Now, in this particular game, though, my opponent decided to trade the knights, which is not the best way to do things. And it's very dangerous for black if they don't follow it up correctly. Now, I will also point out real quick, if black tries to take the pawn on d4, some people might wonder why not just grab the pawn, looks like a freebie. Yeah, here it's a big blunder. You play the move e3, and then wherever the knight moves backwards to, you trade the queens, you fork on f7, and you win the rook in the corner. So, black cannot take the pawn on d4 with the knight, that's for sure. And also at the same time, we're once again threatening to take on c6 2 times. So pawn takes d4 here is also not anything good for black to do. Okay, so that being said, he traded the knights, I took back. He traded the queens, I took back, of course. And he played the move knight to d5, which is the most tenacious move for black here. If he had played knight to d7, which looks reasonable, you know, you move the knight back, you attack the pawn. The best move here is to play knight to a3, and I was familiar with this variation going into the game. It looks like black can take the pawn and protect on c4, but here we go bishop f4 to attack the knight. And the big issue that black runs into is we just have really, really good piece activity. Even though at the moment we're down 2 pawns, we're inevitably going to win the c4 pawn back potentially. And if something like this happens, we are going to win the pawn on e5. We're going to have a fantastic position. Our pieces are great. Black's pawn structure is terrible. I would have obviously been very happy about this. He went for the move knight to d5 instead, though, which is the best response. I think it's very important that we do not take the knight on d5. It looks like we could trade here and win the pawn back and have equal material, but the real issue we run into is black now has the pair of bishops, and they can develop the pieces pretty quickly. They have the queenside pawn majority. I don't think this is all that great for white in the grand scheme of things. So instead of doing that, though, I played the move knight to c3, trying to get rid of his pretty much only developed piece. And also, if he trades the knights as he did in the game, the b file's opened up, the d file's opened up, my bishop is opened up. I was happy about this. Another interesting way of playing here is to go knight to a3 instead. Try to hit the pawn on c4 and take it back that way. And black's best move is to play c3. If they play a move like knight to b6, we actually can get a big advantage with knight to b5 threatening the fork. And if the rook moves away to avoid the fork, maybe worst case scenario, you might be able to take the pawn. Maybe it's not that great. But I think you can also just check on c7, check on g5, and then bring the bishop back. And once these pawns disappear, the rook on b8's not going to be feeling very safe. So anyways, though, I decided to go for the move knight to c3 ultimately. He traded the knights, but now my plan was to play rook b1, hit the b pawn. But I am down a pawn. I'm not necessarily getting the pawn back right away, but I felt like my piece activity was pretty good. He played bishop e7. I played rook b1 hitting the pawn, and he castled. I was hoping, in some regards, that he would play the move rook to b8 to protect the pawn, because now my idea was going to be to play this nice move bishop to c6 with a check. He can't take the bishop due to the pin. He'd have to move the king. And then I can play here, one option is bishop to b5, and I win the pawn back. Another option is to play bishop to d7, and if these bishops get traded, I'll be able to invade on the 7th rank with the rook. Maybe b6, take, rook d7. Again, my pieces are much more active than his, especially this rook on d7 is really good. And but that being said, if he defends tenaciously, it might be a little easier said than done to make progress. But I think white's a little bit better here, because even though we're down the pawn, number one, the extra pawn is doubled, so it's not that huge of a problem. And number two, again, our pieces are just more useful than black's pieces. And our king is, his king is kind of blocking the rook on h8, which is not great. Okay, all that being said, though, he made the better move here, which is just to castle. And I wasn't really so sure if I should take the pawn right away or if I should do something different first. I ended up playing the move bishop to e3. I felt like if I took the pawn, he would play this move rook to b8 to pin my bishop. I go bishop e4 to guard the rook. He trades the rooks. He trades the other pair of rooks. And I really wasn't so sure how to evaluate this endgame. I am back equal in material, but I actually felt like everybody's bishops were just bad. There's not really a great way to attack these pawns in any kind of meaningful way. If I go bishop e3, he'll just play bishop, I don't know, b6 or something. I'm probably better based on activity, but it's not very easy to actually attack all that much in this position. So I could have gone for this. Maybe this is a situation where if I was playing like a higher rated player, I probably would have gone for this, because I feel like white's chances of losing are almost impossible. I think it's very, very hard to lose this without making some gigantic blunder at some point. But against a low rated player, trying to keep pieces on the board, trying to make sure I'm getting into positions where I have a kind of confident idea of what to do. So with that in mind, I actually decided to not take the pawn, and I played the move bishop e3 instead. He played rook b8. He does guard the pawn now that there's no bishop c6 check idea. I actually still played bishop c6 anyways. Obviously, he's not going to take the bishop, but my idea was to bring the bishop back. And, my idea was to bring the bishop back and win the pawn on c4. He played b6. I did bring the bishop back. He played rook d8. I traded the rooks. I did not take the pawn just yet. I think if I take the pawn right away, the downside here is he will eventually, let's say, attack my pawn. I protect it. He'll eventually be able to start mobilizing his queenside pawn majority. And it's actually my position that's not fantastic at the end of the day, because my pawn structure is actually the one that's worse. And his pawns are all pretty solid. Everything in his position is pretty safe. I'd actually rather be black here, to be honest with you. So that's partly the reason why I didn't rush to grab the pawn on c4. I played the move rook to d1 instead, trying to get this rook on the open file. I also knew that the pawn on c4 wasn't really going to get protected or saved anytime soon. He went bishop c7 to hit my pawn. I protect it. And my thinking was, I'm kind of waiting for him to kick my bishop before I take the pawn. Because if I take the pawn too quickly, he might just go ahead and, I don't know, like develop his bishop to b7 or something. He ended up actually playing bishop b7 here, but the downside to this is it does give up the d7 square, and instead of taking the pawn on c4, I prioritize activity first. So I get the rook on the 7th rank, attacking the bishop. He plays rook to c8 to guard it. And I was very happy with what I found in the game here. I ended up finding the best way of playing, which is this move, pawn to f5. I kind of had to reverse engineer this position in some ways to figure out this f5 move. What I originally wanted to do was just to take the pawn back on c4. The problem here is, though, that he plays the move bishop c6, he kicks my rook off of the 7th rank, and then he might just play rook d8, something like this. And I felt like this was either very equal or even slightly better for black, again, because their pawn structure's more compact and solid compared to mine. Now, if I'm not taking the pawn on c4 right away, the question would kind of be, like, what do I do? Do I just make, like, a king move, or do I just make some small improvement? If I make some kind of just king move, for instance, and he plays a6, hit my bishop, I take the pawn. Now he hits the rook off of the 7th rank, for instance. I move backwards. Then he gets to play b5. I move my bishop backwards again. Then he gets to play c4. And once again, I wasn't really entirely sure how to evaluate a position like this. Maybe white's a tiny bit better, but I felt like my pawn structure was not that great, and it didn't feel very obvious what to do from here. So ultimately what I ended up doing was I kind of realized here, if I take on c4, one of my ideas afterwards would be this move f5, trying to break apart this pawn chain that black has at this point, and trying to work around that. So yeah, I was wanting to get rid of this e6 pawn that's blocking off the diagonal, and so I was thinking, if I can take on c4, then play f5, I'm happy about that. But again, if I take on c4, he plays bishop c6, kicks the rook off the 7th rank, and then I don't have the time for f5. So instead of taking on c4 first, what if I play f5 first? And I ultimately worked out that this is the best way to do things. It does require some forward calculation here, though. First of all, if black takes the pawn on f5, now we take on c4, and now we're smooth sailing. If we get to take the f7 pawn, we're able to maintain the rook on the 7th rank, and that's a big plus here. Bishop c6, rook takes f7, and we also can play e6, and yeah, here white's completely winning for sure. So he can't take the f5 pawn. If he takes the e5 pawn, here I just take the bishop on b7, so that's pretty clear cut. Now what he did in the game is he played a6, kicking my bishop. I now take the pawn, and then he plays bishop c6, so it's kind of the same idea of getting the rook off of the 7th rank. The extra benefit I have here, though, is that because I have the pawn up on the f5 square, I'm actually now able to play rook takes f7. Because if the pawn was on f4, this wouldn't work, but with the pawn on f5, the idea is that if black takes the rook, I take on e6 with check, king moves, take the rook. He does take the pawn on e5, and at least at this exact moment, I am up one pawn. I went from being earlier in the game down a pawn out of the opening, which was kind of the plan, to now having kind of 1-2 pawns in the process. So I was down a pawn, I went equal, and now I'm up one pawn. Now that being said, it's not a super clear-cut, okay, you're up a pawn, much better in the endgame kind of thing here. First of all, black is attacking our pawn on c3. That's better. And so the question here is, do I take the a6 pawn and trade a6 for c3 and still be up one pawn? Or do I do something like pawn to c4, probably he plays pawn to a5, and then play this kind of position? I ended up in the game going for bishop takes a6. He took on c3, and I felt like after I got my bishop back to d3, I felt like I had decent winning chances here. I didn't think I was much better, but I am up a pawn. I can maybe start to mobilize the kingside pawns, make a pass pawn one day. But one of the slightly dicey situations here is that black does have their own pass pawn, which we will see becomes pretty relevant as the game goes on. If I had decided instead to play the move c4, and then they play a5, black would not have a pass pawn here. The reason I wasn't crazy about this is because I kind of felt like my bishop was somewhat trapped. I guess I could go to e6. Maybe he goes to e4 and starts to hunt my pawn from behind. The computer says this is very equal as well, quite honestly. If I go to a6, which is apparently the preference, I thought maybe black would still play bishop to e7, or bishop to e4. But I guess here the difference is, well, I mean, it looks like black is taking on f5. Apparently bishop g5 going for the d8 square is the way to go, and it's very touchy. I don't know how else to put it. It's like, you know, I trade the f pawn for the b6 pawn. My bishop on b5 is not that active, but if I can get the b pawn, his a and c pawns are weak. I wasn't really sure. I wasn't really sure how to evaluate these positions in the midst of the game. I ultimately decided to take on a6 and bring the bishop back to d3. Seemed reasonable to me in the moment, but I did understand that black does now have a pass pawn that we'll have to be careful about. He played bishop to d5, and apparently here, the move I made in the game, which looks pretty reasonable, ends up being a mistake. I played the move a4, just keeping the pawn safe. The best move apparently is bishop to b1, which I did think about during the game, but I kind of just thought it looked a bit ridiculous to put the bishop on the b1 square and protect the a2 pawn. It just looked super passive. I don't really know how else to put it. But apparently this is the better way to do things. And I think the real main idea behind this is that when we do play the move a4, the bishop on b3 is actually very annoying. It helps to support the c pawn for black going down the board. I played bishop e5 check to guard my a pawn. But yeah, now if black just moves the bishop out of the way, he has this perfectly placed bishop on b3, and he's just going to push the c4 pawn down the board. And that's kind of what happens pretty quickly here. I went bishop g5, trying to target the b pawn from behind. He played h6. I think he realized pretty quickly that if I try to attack the pawn from behind, he will just check and then push the c pawn. Like, this guards the b pawn, and my own and his own c pawn is very dangerous here. So I decided not to do that. I brought the bishop back to the f4 square. He played king f6. I guard the f5 pawn. He played bishop b2. And quite honestly, we're both kind of getting low on time here, and I kind of start like being super scared all of a sudden, because it looks very difficult to stop the pawn from just pushing down the board and costing me a piece. Fortunately, I did figure out how to hold this position together. Apparently, there's multiple ways to do it. During the game, I didn't really feel that way. What I did though is I went for g4. Apparently, if black plays, apparently black is a tiny bit better here. But I went g4. He went c4. I went h4. He went c3. It looks like his pawn is just going down the board. It looks like I'm doing nothing about it. But I do have g5 check. Pawn takes, king moves, and then this very important move, bishop to e5, that I'd worked out. Bishop to e5 pins the pawn on c3 from behind. If he does push the pawn to c2, I will take the bishop and stop the promotion. And so in that regard, we have kind of frozen the pawn. Now, he pretty much finds a way to force a draw here. I was kind of hoping that he wouldn't figure out what to do, because maybe if I get the chance, I can start to push my own pawns forward. But he figured out pretty quickly what to do here. He played the move bishop to a1, which is really nice. Now he is threatening to play c2, because this time if I take the bishop, and he promotes, my bishop is on a1 instead of the b2 square, and the pawn would promote safely, and I would lose the game. So, like, if I just move the king, he's going to play c2, and even if I try to go back to f4 to guard the square, he goes back to b2, and then he's going to win my bishop. So, now I pretty much have to go back to f4, or at least that's the way I viewed it. Maybe there's other moves that are also fine. I went back to f4, and now if he pushes the pawn, now I will go block the pawn, and he can't really attack my bishop that easily. But let's say the problem here is he just goes back to b2. He's back to threatening to push the pawn. I pretty much have to go back to e5. He went back to a1, and we ended up drawing the game on threefold repetition here. It was an objectively equal position anyways. I was a little bit frustrated that I was up a pawn earlier in the game and not able to win. But my opponent defended well. I think he played good, for sure. And yeah, I ultimately we both kind of were happy with the draw by the end of things. Apparently, I could also try the move bishop c2, bishop d3, which I did think about. The idea being that if he pushes the pawn, I take on c2. He wins one of my bishops, I get the other one. The problem here is this is still just going to be a draw. It's opposite color bishops. He's probably going to pick off one of the pawns pretty soon. Even if this happens, he's just going to take and then attack the pawn. And we're just going to have like a draw by mutual destruction. Even though I have the extra pawn, he can just move the bishop around all day long, and there's no way to win this. So, yeah, my opponent played well, I thought, and I tried to put some pressure on him. In terms of, like, let's say the computer accuracy for this particular game, I played it like a 97.8. My opponent played it a 98.5. Pretty hard to win games when your opponent's playing super well like that. So kudos to him for defending what I think is kind of a tough opening and middle game position. Yeah, that was the 5th round of the tournament. Let's go ahead and get into the 6th round. All right, we're in round number 6 here at this point. I'm playing against a player named Roshan Sethuraman, another player that's rated a little bit over 2,000 FIDE. Yeah, I was given the black pieces in this game. Not a lot of preparation for this particular player either. Once again, if they're not a titled player, at least not an FM, IM, or GM, a little bit harder to prepare. Sometimes even if they are at least over the rating of 2,200 USCF, they might have played in some Title Tuesday tournaments, and you can look at those games. But if the player happens to be in the 2,100s USCF rating, it's kind of like good luck preparing for them individually because it's very hard to find any of their games. So that being said, this game he went for e4. I decided to go back for the Sicilian defense on this one. I didn't go for e5 as I did in the earlier game. Decided to go for the Sicilian defense. Kind of my bread and butter opening, you could call it. So he goes knight f3, I go e6, d4, trade of pawns. I go for knight f6, and then knight c6, and we get what's known as the 4-knight Sicilian on the board here. I've played this a lot online. I've played this in multiple tournaments. I'm pretty comfortable with these variations without really needing to double check them all that much. He decided to trade the knights, and then he played the move e5. This is one of the main ways of playing. One of the other critical variations is for white to play the move knight to b5, aiming to check on the d6 square. There's multiple ways you can play against this. Bishop to b4 is one of the main moves. Pawn to d6 transposes into the Sveshnikov Sicilian, which is just a whole different variation that's very theoretical and complicated. And bishop to c5 is what's known as the Cobra variation, which we will see a game of in the next video that I play in a later round of the event. But yeah, I can kind of play any of these different options. So if somebody's watching this, try to prepare for me, figuring out what I can do. I can play all 3 of these in some regards, and yeah, good luck preparing for all 3 of them if you don't have very much time. So, anyways, though, he decides to take on c6, which is another perfectly good option. We recapture with the b pawn, and the best move for white is to play pawn to e5. And essentially here, white is trying to take advantage of the fact that we have a bunch of pawns on light squares, and we have weakened our d6 dark square. Playing knight to b5 is kind of the same idea. You're trying to target the weak square on d6 once again. But knight takes c6, and then e5 is a different way of doing it. Now, the downside of this setup from white is they do weaken the d5 square, so we are able to hop the knight in. white usually plays the move knight to e4 to continue fighting for control of the d6 square. And there's a number of different ways to play this position as black as well. There's queen to c7, f4, queen to b6. This is one way of playing. There's setups with rook to b8, and then after c4, there's even some like piece sacrifice ideas, which are really interesting. There's queen to a5 check to begin with, and then queen back to b6. I ultimately decide to go for bishop to b7, which is a little bit of a sideline. But I've kind of found that most people aren't super familiar with how to play against this. But even if they are familiar with how to play against it from, let's say, an opening theory perspective, I've played this a bunch online. I've played this in a bunch of tournaments once again, and I'm pretty familiar with the middle games that can occur. So my opponent did seem to know the opening theory at the very least, because he blitzed out the kind of, let's say, correct moves pretty quickly. Bishop to e2 is one of the main lines. Pawn to c4 is another variation. But yeah, he went for bishop to e2. I play pawn to c5. The idea here is now just to open up the diagonal for the bishop. He castled. I attacked the pawn on e5. He checked. I take the knight. He takes back. Very important here that we do not recapture the pawn on d6. He would play the move c4 and win a piece due to the pin. Instead, we begin by making the move queen to c6, lining up with the queen and the bishop, aiming towards the pawn on g2. White has a couple of ways of working around this. In the game, he decided to play the move f3 to blunt the diagonal. And here I go for the move queen to b6, which is kind of, you could say, like a sideline of a sideline. The main move here, statistically speaking, is to play the move c4, preventing white from playing c4 themselves. The drawback to this particular setup is white can now play the move queen d4, forking the pawns. We castle, they take there, we take on d6 inevitably. And I'm not a gigantic fan of these positions. White has the bishop pair and pretty much no weaknesses in their position. We have an isolated a pawn and slightly weak d pawn. Objectively speaking, the position is totally fine for black, but I am not a gigantic fan of this. I might play some of these variations against a higher rated opponent if I'm more happy with a closer to equal type of game. In this particular game, though, I decide to go for queen to b6. And part of the idea is to play c4 with a check if white doesn't play c4 themselves. At least that's one idea. So white did play c4. Now the knight goes to the b4 square. And the downside of white playing c4 is at some point we want to bring the knight back to c6, put the knight on d4. The d4 square is a nice outpost at this point, and the pawn on d6 will be pretty hard for white to keep protected forever. He plays bishop to e3. Pawn to a5 is the best move. You have to play this right away. If you decide to castle first, you are going to walk into the move a3 and then b4, and this is very, very bad for black. So you play the move a5 in order to control the b4 square. He does kick the knight retreats, but now he can't play b4 because we have the a pawn that can take. He plays queen to c2, protecting the b2 pawn. And yeah, already I think he has slightly misplayed the opening. I don't think queen to c2 is the best move. The move I'm at least a bit more familiar with is like queen to d2 and rook to b1, and essentially white is trying to play the move b4 at the right time. Queen to c2 I was a little bit surprised by. I took a little bit of time here to figure out how I was going to play. I ultimately went with the move rook to c8. I definitely would like to play knight to d4 right away. The reason this doesn't work, though, is white will take the knight, and then they'll play the move c5. And now their pawn on d6 is well supported. They can play b4 in the future to guard the c5 pawn. And now it's actually my own d4 pawn, which is a bit more of a sitting duck here. So I can't play knight to d4 just yet, but that move is going to come in handy in the future. So I played rook c8 first. Now I am aiming to play knight d4. Like, if white plays, I don't know, just some completely random move for whatever reason, now I go knight d4, and you can't play c5 anymore because the rook is controlling the c5 square. And now the d6 pawn is most likely going to be captured next. So he played rook to c1 instead. Now if I go knight d4, he'll take the knight and then still play c5. So right now it's kind of a big fight for the c5 square. I castle. He goes rook to d1, and rook to d1 ends up being a little bit of an inaccuracy because now I have a little bit of free time. I played the move e5, and now knight d4 is going to come. And instead of taking back on d4 with the c pawn, I'm going to take back with the e pawn. And if I can play knight d4, take back with the pawn, the d6 pawn is going to be captured. And so I was decently happy with the position already at this point. He did play the most tenacious move here. He played queen f5. Now he's targeting my d7 pawn since I just moved the e pawn. I did go for knight to d4. If I went for rook to d8 or protected the d pawn first, I figured he would go bishop d3, threatening to take the pawn. g6, queen here, and I felt like this looked super dangerous. I thought I might just get mated here if I wasn't careful. So I played knight d4 right away. He does take the knight. I take with the e pawn. He gets the he played bishop d3 first. If he tries to take the pawn on d7 first, at the very least I can play rook d8 and then win the pawn back on d6. We'll see something similar to this in the game in a moment. So he first played bishop to d3, threatening checkmate. I block that off. He takes the pawn, and here I remember during the game. First of all, going into this game, I was quite tired for some reason. Even though this might look like, the way you're watching the video and seeing the games in a sequence, you might think that, oh, game number 6, he's played like 3 games in a row or something like that. This was actually the first game of the day, but I remember still being quite tired when I went to this game, and so for whatever reason, in the midst of this game, I kind of just had this slight nagging feeling of just like wanting to go back to my hotel room and go back to sleep, which is not a great mentality to have when you're in the midst of a competition or in the midst of a game especially. So I remember here looking at the best move, which is bishop to c6. I definitely did think about this move. This is objectively the strongest move. I felt like white would play queen to e7. And then I thought I would play rook to e8. Or sorry, I realized that rook to e8 does not work because of d7. If I take the queen, he gets a new queen and he's up a rook. So I realized that didn't work. And I thought maybe I would go rook to d8 and maybe I'd try to win the pawn back, but it felt a little bit slow here. I did miss the resource in the game of playing bishop to a4, attacking the rook on d1 first. If the rook moves away, then we can take the pawn on b2, which looks a little dicey to go for because it looks kind of scary to let white just keep this d pawn alive, but apparently black is better off in this position. I will point out real quick that if you try to take the pawn on b2 right away, I think here white can push the pawn and then take on c5, which is one of the slight problems here. In comparison, if you go bishop c6 or bishop a4 first and then take the pawn, the difference here is that apparently black has this move queen to d2, which hits the bishop, guards the a pawn, and then you'll take on d7 afterwards. Kind of tricky stuff to rationalize, quite honestly. Ultimately, I thought about bishop c6 in the game, which is the best move, but I kind of ruled it out because I didn't like the look of the resulting positions. I went for the move rook to d8 instead, which does lose part of my advantage, but it only loses part of my advantage if white plays the best way. I expected him to he has to either play queen e7 or queen b5. If he had played queen to b5, which is apparently the best move, I was actually totally fine with this. I was going to take the pawn. If he trades the queens, now black is actually just in good shape because white's pawn on b2 is always going to be a liability. And if he doesn't trade queens, I might just play bishop a6 and kind of force the queen trade. I would have been happy in this position here. He ended up playing the move queen to e7 instead. Now I played rook to e8. He put the queen back on d7. And now that I've essentially gotten the move rook to e8 in for free, because if you think about what we had just a moment ago, we had this position without the rook on e8. Now we have the position with the rook on e8. I should have thought more, once again, about the bishop c6 plan here. I figured he'd have to move backwards to g4. And I have to watch out for d7. I can't take on b2 because d7 is going to fork the two rooks. I can go rook to d8 to attack the pawn. I thought he would go rook to e1 to fight for the open file, and I wasn't really so sure how to evaluate something like this. At the end of the day, though, this ends up just being better for black, quite honestly. Mostly it's because we have the passed pawn on d4, which means that the bishop on d3 is kind of stuck in place for a while. We're still attacking the b2 pawn, even though we can't take it yet because our rook would hang. But I was a little bit worried about white having like a rook e7 move, or the queen coming in at the right time, or something like that. Quite honestly, it's bad evaluation because I'm worried about ideas rather than being worried about specific moves. And this is what I even talk to students about, like you would call this like monsters under the bed syndrome. That's at least the way I think of it. You're worried about the idea of something being under the bed or the idea of something scary in the position. But if, as soon as you look under the bed and there's nothing there, then you're not scared anymore. As soon as you calculate the position in the game and realize it's not a big deal, then you're not scared anymore. So it's kind of the same situation here at this point. I saw this type of position in my kind of calculation, but I didn't really evaluate it correctly or evaluate it objectively. I was more worried than I needed to be. And so ultimately I did not go for something like this. I ended up just repeating the position and actually just going for a draw, which is really a bit of a chicken way of playing here. We ended up just going back and forth and getting the draw at this point, and that was the end of the game. I am a little bit better off in this position. It's not like I missed a win or anything like that, but I could have definitely pressed harder here and tried to actually play the game out and try to play for a win. It did not really help that, as I said earlier, like going into the game, I wasn't feeling at my best anyways, but objectively, I should have tried to play this out and try to win this rather than just going for the draw. So it is what it is. That's the way that the game panned out. We ended up getting a draw in this game. So at this point, I have, let's see, I lost the first round, drew the second round, won the third round, lost the fourth round, and then drew the fifth and sixth rounds. So I'm sitting on 1.5 to 2.5. So I'm sitting on 2.5 out of 6, which is not a fantastic score. I have lost to an international master and a grandmaster, but I have drawn 3 different games against lower rated players, which is not really helping at that point. But yeah, so that's how the first 6 rounds have panned out here. I will be also releasing another video that shows the final 3 rounds of this tournament, my recap of those. So hopefully you'll look forward to that. If you haven't had the chance to check out the first 3 rounds of the tournament, that'll be in the video kind of here on the screen if you want to check that out. That being said, I'll see you in the next video for the last 3 rounds, and I will give you the recap of those. See you in that one.